What are some stories your parents, grand or grandparents told you about World War II? My late grandpa always said somebody is always looking over you. I guess this was his case in World War II. His first night in London, the Luftwaffe were bombing the city and his sergeant told him to move his butt to the bunker. The whole area around the bunker was just large craters from bombs. Everyone survived. He arrived at Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day. It wasn't until he was at a Frion board in France and saw the bodies of deceased Allied soldiers laying in the woods. This is where crap got real for him. Some time later, Germany makes a last-ditch effort. Battle of the Bulge. Allied forces, especially Americans, suffered heavy casualties. He was sent back to England to train as a medic. He knew this meant fighting on the front lines. Some time later he arrives via train in a small blown-up town. But the battle ended. He told me he was one lucky sob. One thing he always reminded my family members was that someone is always watching over you and be thankful for them, whatever or whoever that may be. And I'm one lucky sob that he can now watch over me. My father-in-law was born in Hungary and raised in Yugoslavia. When the Germans came through, they conscripted the young men into the army. One day he was left to guard 2 New Zealand soldiers who suggested he take them over to the American line, which he did. It was an African-American battalion which welcomed him. The remainder of the war he spent as a welder for the American army, later immigrating to Canada. My grandfather was deployed in Africa and then into Italy and the Alps. I remember him talking about being strafed in the desert by a German fighter. They tried to hide behind sand dunes and had the satisfaction of seeing a British fighter who was chasing shoot down the German one. He talked about washing his clothes in petrol because they had more of it than water. He talked about how beautiful some of places were. He fondly talked about riding motorbikes around. He talked about his best friend being killed. I can't remember fully, but think it was a jeep going over a mine or being shelled maybe. He was awarded the military medal for bravery. His dispatchers said he worked for 48 hours continuously laying comms cables so that a division who was stuck on a mountain under artillery fire could relay targets to a friendly artillery division and enabled their retreat as the Germans pulled back. My granddad died last year. He was kind, polite, unassuming and had a great sense of humor. For most of his life he suffered from nightmares and didn't start to talk about the war until a few years before he died. Uncle, North Africa, Purple Heart, told me he was mowed down by heavy machine gun fire, got about 3 rounds on the legs. He had to lay under corpses for 2 days before he could safely move out. I just cannot fathom the pain, thirst, hunger, nausea, fear a man has to feel when put into that sort of situation. He also told me they always plundered German forces as their food rations were better. He skipped mentioning the M though, and with his war memorabilia he kept a few photos of German soldiers, their girlfriends, wives and or family. Did not tell me why. My grandfather was 10 years old when the war started. Whenever he speaks of those times, it is usually in the context of young men from the town he grew up in simply left and never came back. He will always mention his favorite cousin, Buster, who was 16 and was killed on his first day of fighting. My grandmother, Jewish, lived in Vilnius before the war. She was in a village near town when Operation Barbarossa began and planes started bombing Vilnius. She was only 5. She and her aunt and uncle fled on a train eastwards, crossing the Volga on a ferry and eventually reaching Uzbekistan. The rest of her family, including her parents and brother and sister, were killed in a mass extermination program carried over the summer in Vilnius. After the war she came to Israel and started a new life. She helped establish the desert kibbutz of Ein Gedi. She lived a happy life since and died last year, surrounded by friends and family. Love you, Grandma. My father was born during World War II and remembers that when they were in the shelters the kids would go out and look at the planes going past. He didn't live anywhere near a city so they were low risk. He also remembers being confused as to why they didn't have to use the blackout blinds anymore. My nana used to drive ambulances during the Blitz. She told me about how she would pick up survivors and shell-shocked people and drive them to hospital. My mum was born on V-Day. My grandfather was still very young during the Second World War, but one story has been told in our family over and over again. My family lived in one of the Nazi-occupied territories and both resistance movements and collaboration was rife in the region. Not to be a judge here, if the choose was between collaboration or starvation. Who knows what choice one makes. I believe it was 1943 and the occupation was really beginning to bite, but the brother of my grandfather's father, uncle, was due to be married. Gossip was that the girl in question was pregnant, so delaying was not really an option here. The day of the wedding, members of the resistance shot 2 prominent collaborators in the region. Furious, local police forces organized a manhunt and of course they ended up at the wedding, which probably drew the largest crowd in the village that evening. Apparently, all men were separated from the women and kept under shot. The groom, grandfather's uncle, too, was being threatened and his bride was quite hysterical. My grandfather's father, the eldest son and due to the death of his father, head of the family, pleaded their innocence and got a rifle butt in the stomach and a boost to his face for the effort. At that point, my grandfather's grandmother, a very small and rotund woman, got between the head of the police and her family. She was known throughout the village as a very generous and joyful woman, with a strict sense of community. She was very devout, who went out of her way to help people. Apparently, she told the head of the local police in the most haughty town to leave her and her family be and stop disrupting the wedding. The head of police raised his gun toward her and threatened to shoot her. She replied, "Sure, go ahead, but don't you dare to lay a finger on my son and his wife." At which point the chief of police waved his gun again and pulled the whole "don't you know who I am" spiel. To which my grandmother, apparently very calmly, replied, "I will never forget who you are. I will never forget that I stopped by your house for 2 years to help your mother while she wasted away. I will never forget that my family helped save all you father's cows when his barn burned to the ground 10 years ago. And if you shoot me, by God I hope you won't forget that you shot the woman you run to when you're frightened of the thunder as a little cheerleader who whipped your face when you were sick. Every day I fear for the lives of my family. I fear the Germans. I fear the bombs, but as long as I live, I will never be afraid of someone who grew up in my own village." At which point the chief of police turned a peculiar shade of crimson and left the premises with his men, with the wedding resuming without further disturbances. To me this story means everything about World War II, not about troop movements, generals, great good and evil, but merely people, citizens, living from day to day under difficult circumstances. In Italy, my grandma stole a loaf of bread and got shot at escaping. She didn't get hit. She said for the next 10 days it's all her and the other 7 or 8 family members ate, and they were in a small house no bigger than this family room. She said while sitting in a normal sized family room in a normal sized house. A friend of my grandfather's had been sent to live in the countryside disguising as one of a farmer's children. The farmer had 3 daughters, to keep him safe from the Nazis. Somehow this was found out and the Nazi soldiers came to the farmer's house checking everywhere for a boy, since they knew the farmer only had daughters. Amazingly, the farmer's eldest daughter ran and dressed him up as a girl, and he was kept safe. The incredible assertiveness and courage of that girl saved his life. My grandma was in her 70s getting a full body scan for something. The doctors approach my mom and ask her if she has any idea how my grandma got a large amount of buckshot in her legs. The doctors had already asked my grandma and she couldn't remember. The next day, my grandma had been thinking and thinking, and she goes, "Must have been when I was making dynamite during the war." My grandma was a Rosie the Riveter. My grandpa and his best friend, born on the same day, asked their dads to sign them up the day of their high school graduation. They were 17. On the way to Japan after basic training, the war ended and they were in occupied Japan for a while. My grandpa had a girl he was writing to but his friend didn't, so my grandpa suggested writing to his sister. Well, he didn't. When they got back, they got married. My grandpa died in 1989 and my great uncle about 5 years ago. Their hometown rebuilt a plaza downtown and my family got a big stone with their names and brothers in arms, brothers-in-law. Warning, pretty gnarly details. My grandma was just a kid when Japan invaded China, just straight up marching through villages and killing everyone. But what fricked her up the most is that when they invaded her village, they found a pregnant woman, held her down, took bets on what the gender of the baby was and cut her open. They pulled the fetus out, bets were paid, and then they just threw the baby up in the air and left. Like, bro. I can't even imagine what that did to your grandma. Was not really a story she told me, but my paternal grandmother came to live with us as a result of Alzheimer's when I was a small child. She used to have flashbacks of her childhood in England with air raids. She would start yelling to get down, the bombers are coming, and crawl under the kitchen table. As a small child I thought she was just pretty great at playing with me and would crawl under there with her and make a fort. One grandfather was drafted into the Army Air Corporation. He had vertigo and couldn't fly. He was trained as a radio gunner. He could sit in an aircraft. He just couldn't operate a radio, navigate, or operate a gun in the air. He would pass out. I remember that he could never look straight up. If he did, he'd immediately fall down. He was really good at repairing radios, so that worked out. Because he couldn't fly, they kept busting him back to private every so often. As I recall, he was a master sergeant at his highest, but was discharged as a PFC. He had flight wings. He just couldn't wear them. I guess it's good that he was undeployable. He would have been flying the hump and likely died. Instead he got married, moved back to the farm, and raised us all. The other grandfather was conscripted into the German army in Serbia. He was a clerk and was able to stay off the line because he could take dictation. He knew shorthand. Once the commandant couldn't keep him around anymore, they'd sent everyone to the Eastern Front. He told him to run west. The Allies were already there anyway. He, through a complicated series of adventures, made it to Austria. He ended up in a DP camp and then came to the US with his wife and my dad about 8 years later. One grandmother left France the day of the invasion of Poland. She was a grifter and was able to get herself onto the last ship out. They were shutting down ocean traffic in France. She was an American from Decatur, IL, and just happened to be traveling when the invasion happened. She met my grandfather during the war. As I recall, she was in Virginia, but I could be wrong. They moved around a bit during the war as my grandpa couldn't be deployed base to base. My other grandmother was living in Croatia during World War II. Her town was an alternate target for the Allies. They would drop in the fields, not the town. They just had to lose a weight to land. They weren't trying to destroy the town. It produced nothing. Unfortunately, she was usually in the fields when the bombs were dropped, so she'd just drop in the rows and pray. She also had German soldiers billeted with her family. She also fled west to Austria and married my grandpa. They were in the same camp. Hey, I'm from Decatur, Ill. I'm also part of the local historical commission. I'd be interested in learning more about your grandmother if you don't mind sharing. My great-great-grandfather was a British prisoner of war in Germany in World War II. Our story of him is that he overheard the Germans going on about how good their mustard was. So he decided to tell them about hot English mustard but leave out the hot part. He convinced them to put a thick layer of hot English mustard on and eat it. My granddad said he went to the pictures one night in Bow, East London. When he came out of the cinema, he'd walked halfway down the street before the building was bombed to smithereens. Anyone who hadn't left the screening quickly had been killed. My grandfather on my mom's side was born in Russia and lived and worked on a farm. He escaped with a few other men from his village and got through Europe on foot and into Spain, where they eventually got on a boat to Canada. His entire story is fascinating, but I have one favorite part. He told us that several times over the years, German soldiers would march down the road outside of the farm he lived on. He was 14 or 15 years old at the time and had decided that he hated all soldiers, regardless of their loyalties. So when these soldiers would march by, he would take his father's hunting rifle to the roof of the barn and shoot at them. He says he doesn't know if he ever connected with any of them, but they knew they were being shot at, as they would run for cover behind the trucks or trees. I guess I am lucky to exist at all, since my grandfather had taken steps to ensure he would be shot. My gran was only a kid during World War II, so as to not scare her too much, her mum told her the lights in the sky were fireworks. She'd never seen them before, so she didn't know any difference between the two. She sat at her window all night and watched as Clydebank was destroyed. Said it lit up the sky like it was sunrise all night. She listened to the bombs all night long, oblivious to the destruction occurring a few miles away. They were on the other side of the Clyde and far enough away they weren't told to evacuate. And now to lighten the mood. After the war, the same Gran was around 7 years old. She was given a banana. It was the first time she'd ever seen one. She just bit into that thing like an apple. Because no one told her how to eat it. She's in her 80s now. Still refuses to eat bananas. My grandfather was in World War I and World War II, but this story is from World War I. He was in the Canadian Army in the trenches playing poker. Ended losing all of his money shortly before leave. So he stayed at the front and the rest of his platoon went to Paris. After they get back and he's saved up enough money, he takes his leave and has a great time. Comes back to the front and finds out that the whole platoon had been killed in a gas attack. My great grandpa was a Navy officer during World War II, and apparently he had to get out after the war because he wasn't eligible for a promotion because he didn't meet a height requirement. My grandfather was born in 1924 and had to join the army the day after his 18th birthday. He got a letter along with his birthday cards. It turned the party into a very somber affair. He never talked much about the war. He just told me about the moment when reality hit him that he was in a war. He saw a dead soldier hanging in a tree from his parachute and mistook him for his best friend. Until that point he had only worked as an airplane mechanic. He was actually an apprentice for a photographer and watchmaker. After he died, we found some pictures that he had taken during his training as a mechanic, and later when his unit was sent to Russia, there were notes on the back. The contrast between the pictures is unreal. During training they all look like a bunch of kids during summer camp, even going swimming and stuff. In the Russia pictures they look as if they aged 20 years. The last pictures are of landscapes, flowers and some aerial views of lakes etc. Maybe a way to calm himself down. You'd never guess they were taken in a war zone. My granduncle, grandfather's brother-in-law, was 3 years older and a clergyman in training. First he got captured by the Russians and later by the British. He said he preferred the British because they let him work as a driver and shared their tea with him. He refused to tell us what happened while he was with the Russians. My granduncle's wife, was sent away to work at various farms. She was also a professional pen pal for soldiers who had no family at home. The soldiers wouldn't know the girls' real names for modesty reasons. She kept some of their letters. One guy even wrote in his final letter that he likely wouldn't live to write another one. It was bundled with an official letter that said her service would no longer be needed for that particular soldier. She eventually met one of the guys she had exchanged letters with and married him, but he started to abuse her horribly. The marriage lasted for 2 years. My grandmother, grand-aunt sister and grandfather's wife, was still a kid. Born 1930, she only remembers that they had to leave their farm from one day to the next. They were sent to various places around the country while also trying to figure out where her sister and older brother had ended up. When they finally had a permanent home, they got a letter with a photograph that showed a wooden cross in a forest somewhere in Russia with her brother's name on it. Up until I found that picture by chance, I didn't even know that she had a brother because nobody dared to talk about him. Even when I asked, they only told me that he had been their brother and nothing else. My grandmother was one of the women who built P-40 Warhawks. Those were interesting stories. My grandfather was stationed in the Philippines, I believe. He told me stories of his time as a flamethrower operator, like how his unit would lie in wait for a Japanese tank to roll close by and he'd jump on the front of the tank, shove the nozzle of the flamethrower in the viewport of the tank, and pull the trigger. Yeah, I was 12 when he was telling me this. Grandfather was in the Royal Artillery. He was a gunner in a light anti-aircraft unit and stayed in Britain until 1944 when he went over to France as part of the D-Day invasion. At the end of the war he was somewhere in Germany, but he never spoke in any detail about his experiences. He always claimed he couldn't remember. Grandma was fresh out of university and went to work for the Meteorological Office. She used to give weather reports to pilots just before they went on missions. I remember her telling me she hated it because it was so difficult to be accurate. Not an interesting story, and I don't have any details, but my great-grandfather, an adventurous soul, joined the Finns in their war against Soviet as a volunteer when he was more than 50 years old, earned a medal, but unfortunately I don't have the details. Sounds like the Winter War or Continuation War. My great-grandfather was a paratrooper in World War II. He had combat jumps at Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. During the Battle of the Bulge, a tank sent shrapnel into his unit, catching him in the leg. He is amputated from the knee down on his left leg now. He is 95 and still kicking. He earned a Purple Heart for his efforts also. My grandfather was 3 when the war started. He says when he was at school, there were some POWs who would spend their time making toys out of wood, which they would then throw over the fence into the schoolyard for the children. The story my grandfather told me that I like the most. The best moment in this war was the moment after 2 years in a Russian war prison when we drive home in a train to Germany and cut out our SS tattoo from our shoulder. This scar reminds me my whole life that I do something wrong. Great-grandfather died 15 years ago. My granddad was a British paratrooper and sniper in the 6th Airborne Division. One story he told me about being a sniper is he'd find his spot overlooking German troops. He'd then get 2 bullets ready and aim for the machine gunner. He'd take him out and wait for his replacement, then take him out, and that'd be it. He also told me the average life expectancy of a paratrooper was 6 minutes after landing. I know he dropped just prior to D-Day at Pegasus Bridge. Another time he got lost behind enemy lines and my nan got a mere presumed dead letter from the military, but then my granddad got a French lady to write saying he was alive. I'm unsure how he survived that. He actually didn't talk much about the war and his experience, but he was amazing and my hero. I named my son after him. My great-grandfather was in the 82nd Airborne Division as a paratrooper during Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. He said the main reason that the life expectancy was so low was because many of the jumps were unorganized or the wind would blow everyone off course. My grandfather served as a British paratrooper in a glider, as a combat medic, and seen quite a few bad things. From what I understand, he joined absurdly early, at the age of 14. He also joined alongside several friends and even his brother. One of his combat landings was really rough. My mother got him to explain what had happened before his death, and it goes a little like this. Grandpa is in a glider coming into a field in the night. This field happened to be previously flooded up to waist height, and there were many obstacles which effectively destroyed several gliders and killed most of their crew occupants. His job was to rescue several of these people, and he did so, but during this he had to witness several of his hometown friends drown. Later in the mission he is moving along hedgerows and finds his brother. They serve as a defensive line, and while they were talking his brother was shot by a sniper. He was the one who had to carry the body back, as well as take tags. This later came back to haunt my mother and her brother's sisters, as grandpa still did not live down the deaths of his friends and brother. When they said they were scared of swimming in a pool, he'd toss them into it and shout swim or die. Eventually my grandmother divorces him, and we lost contact with grandpa up till about 5 years ago. It was a very odd experience learning about all of this. This story comes from my great uncle. He was flying for the Americans over Poland, if I recall correctly, and went to meet up with some other planes. As he got closer he realized they were German planes and tried to get away, but was shot down. He parachuted out, broke an ankle on landing, and passed out. Some time later, a motorcycle rolled up and a German officer threw him on and took him back to their medics. After a couple weeks, they woke up one morning and all the Germans were gone and left the patients. They decided to stay put, and a few hours later some Americans showed up and exclaimed the war was over. I'm late to the party, but my great-grandfather's story deserves to be told to some randos. Basically my great-grandfather was a B-17 bomber pilot for the US. He was the main pilot and not a co-pilot. One day though, one of his friends got sick before and run, and my great-grandfather, who wasn't meant to go, filled in for him. He filled in as a co-pilot. Well, crap goes south and his bomber gets hit badly by flak. It being a B-17 however is still flying, although dropping altitude fast. They were too far south to get back to England, so they push for Switzerland. They think they're almost there, but they're getting real low now. What's left of the bomber crew bails out except my great-grandfather and the other pilot. There's a problem. The bomber in its current trajectory is going to crash into a small town. Thinking that won't be a good look if it's a town in Switzerland, they decide to go into a dive to get more airspeed. They pull up and angle the plane to go over the town. Both my great-grandfather and the other pilot bail out when the bomber goes into the stall at the top. They land safely and the bomber goes right over the town and crashed into the side of the hill. The only problem however is they're about 5 miles from the Swiss border and right next to a German airport. They almost immediately get found and put into a POW camp. My grandma and grandpa visited the town a few years ago and to our surprise not only was there still a huge dent in the side of the hill where the bomber crashed, but the town had kept pieces of the bomber and shell casings. They were extremely welcoming and thankful for my great grandfather's actions and wish they could have done something to not let them be captured. My primary school age grandma farted on a girl's head in a bunker during the Blitz. That's the main memory she has of it all. Looks like that was the least deadliest bomb of the war. My grandfather was a chef in the army. Said he watched a guy use one of his knives to kill himself because he was being sent overseas for World War II. My great uncle earned a Bronze Star as an engineer, crane operator, during the Battle of Remagen. The story goes that he was wounded 3 times over the course of a single day during the battle. He just got patched up and kept going, because they had to keep the Remagen Bridge up. My grandmother worked in the tool room at Ryan Aeronautical building PT-22 recruit training aircraft for the Air Corps. Worked there 49 years until they forced her to retire. I still have some of the Ryan Aeronautical mugs glassware they gave her over the years, as well as the Firebee target drone desk model they gave her. Towards the end of the war, my grandpa was shot down over Germany. He and his gunner made it out, but his pilot went down with the plane. He parachuted onto a farmhouse in the middle of dark, breaking his leg. Luckily he was in a British occupied area, so in the morning the 10th Scots Guard picked him up and brought him to the nearest field station, a concentration camp liberated just days before, Bergen-Belsen. He really did see it all and he became very religious. After the war he would later go on and fight in the Israeli 1948 independence. He has a really interesting story that would take hours to tell. In 1939 when Germany first invaded, my grandfather on my mom's side was almost executed for trying to argue with an SS officer about taking away their pigs. My grandmother had to beg for his life to be spared. After the war for the first year or so they survived by eating weeds because during the war the Germans took everything and then when the Soviets came through they did it all over again. My great grandfather on my dad's side fought in World War I. In 1939 when the Soviets invaded in the east he was taken as a POW and sent east, and eventually became a conscript in the Soviet military. Didn't return home until early 1950. I think I've told this story before, but it's so good. The grandpa of a friend of mine was stationed at the Swiss border to Germany. He told him that from time to time German soldiers would sneak across the border and place buckets full of human feces all over the station of the Swiss soldiers. The buckets had notes in them that said greetings from Germany or stuff like that. So one day, grandpa and his soldier friends were fed up with the shenanigans and took a bucket themselves. They filled it up with cheese, meat, eggs and everything else that was hard to get expensive as frick in the rest of the EU. They took the bucket, creeped up to the German border and placed it with a note that said, "Everyone gives what they can in those hard times." No more shit buckets were found after that. I've told this before on here. He drove a Higgins boat, landing craft, in the Pacific. The first time he approached the beach he kept hearing bees. There seems to be all over the place. He was wondering why bees would be so far out from the island. There were just a whole bunch of them buzzing at him. They weren't bees. They were bullets. He also had a really unusual run-in on one of the islands. After the initial landings on Guadalcanal some of the Navy guys were sent ashore as support for the guys fighting. Anyway he was walking by the place where they were keeping the Japanese POWs. One of them called out his name, startling him to say the least. It turned out to be a kid he went to school with in grade school. The kid was the son of a Japanese diplomat who was stationed in the US. He told us a few more, but those are the ones that stood out. Also, my great uncle was a US Marine in World War II and Korea. At the beginning of the Korean War, he was with a tank battalion moving through a valley. The valley was mined and they had engineers ahead clearing the mines. They were then ambushed and the engineers were all killed. He ran ahead of the tanks and cleared out the mines which allowed them to get through and out from under the enemy ambush. He got a Silver Star for that. Also a Purple Heart and a couple other awards. It didn't really dawn on me, even being a Marine myself, how big of a deal it was, until he passed away about 8 years ago. He was buried at the Veterans Cemetery in Jackson, NJ. During the ceremony, the Marine Corps did a flyover with CH-53 and CH-46 helicopters. He ended up being a gunny and drill instructor before he retired. Tough sob, smoked like a chimney and had like 5 or 6 bypass surgeries before finally succumbing to Alzheimer's well into his 80s. Please excuse any lack of military terms, it's not exactly my forte. My grandfather and 3 great uncles fought in World War II. 3 stormed the beaches of Normandy and 1 fought in the Pacific. The one that fought in the Pacific, Uncle Herman, was in the Navy and loves to tell the tale of how his ship and others were being bombed by kamikazes, and his job was to load one of the ship's giant butt machine guns while someone else fired them at the planes. At the peak of the battle, one guy, or according to Uncle Herman, the lil chicken crap, who was firing the gun freaked out and told my uncle he was abandoning his post. Being the loyal, upstanding old American sailor that my Uncle Herman was, he said he grabbed the guy by his collar and shoved him back in his seat. When the guy made a move to leave again, Uncle Herman decked him square in the nose, loaded the gun, pulled the guy out from behind it, and proceeded to shoot down a kamikaze plane. After the battle had subsided, Uncle Herman and the Lil Chicken Crap were called before their commanding officer. Lil Chicken Crap was demoted and Uncle Herman was fined $5 for hitting a fellow sailor. Uncle Herman always laughs and says that was the best $5 he ever spent. I firmly believe he did deck a guy for abandoning his post, but I always question his taking down a plane. It's just fun to listen to him boast about what he did in his heyday. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.